Hello, hello.
Oh, yes.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is thrilling, really. I'm so pleased to be here.
So yeah, thank you very much for coming. It is actually thrilling to be finally in conversation with you, Zach.
It's been too long, Julie.
It's been too
We've
long.
waited forever for this.
Forever. Just a little bit about Zak Ové, for those of you who don't know who he is. Born in London, he's a British-Caribbean artist with a multidisciplinary practice across sculpture, film, and photography. His work is informed through the history and lore carried through the African diaspora to the Caribbean, Britain, and beyond, with particular focus on traditions of masking and masquerade as a tool of self-emancipation. Ové's artworks explore the interplay between old world mythology and potential futures, a space where he reinterprets present existence into the fantastical, and we'll see that. His work is a celebration of the power of play and the spirit of imagination in the blurring of edges between reality and possibility. In this way, Ové seeks to rewrite history for the future through heralding the past in a new light. Ové's works are featured in a number of museums, including the AGO, of course, and the ROM, and private collections, and he curated the acclaimed exhibition, Get Up, Stand Up Now, Generations of Black Creative Pioneers in 2019.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So I'm going to be doing, right. As you know, we've dedicated Life Between Islands, this iteration of the exhibition, which traveled from the Tate, to the memory of your father, who sadly passed in 2023. Pioneering filmmaker, photographer, visionary, social justice warrior, Sir Horace Shango Ové.
Thank you. Yeah.
Who passed away, again, last year. In terms of his oeuvre, you are quoted as saying that your father, quote, keenly observed the time he found himself living and had the insight to record and transcribe through film, photography, and writing. Only a handful of individuals from the 60s did that, which in part is why Horace's work holds such relevance today, politically, socially, and racially. Why don't we start with that?
I mean, Horace was an extreme tour de force in that sense, and was born in a magical time and era, I guess. As a child in Belmont in Trinidad, he grew up in an age where steel pan was still illegal and being played in the dry riverbeds, where colonialism and the law that had come from Britain was still in massive effect, where our history was still entangled to a colonial past. And he was part of a rebellious band of Trinidadians that saw that things should be otherwise. I think what was interesting is also the independence movement began in the Carnivalist movement with jamettes and a whole scene. And to me, it was very interesting to discover that on my trips back to Trinidad and to understand how that affected them as men and women growing up to try and find a way to change the bigger societies and the colonial world at large. Horace traveled to Britain in the early 60s, along with a band of peers who were very interested in Marxism and kind of radical change that might affect the Caribbean and their own histories. And in doing so, I mean, he had an amazing life. He began his film career as a slave on the set of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, which was then taken to Rome. And he and a bunch of Caribbean men and women at that point in time were also all incarcerated on this big movie set with 15,000 extras. Horace was smart enough to realize that this was the beginning of something way more important. And 10 years after that, when he was making one of the first productions for the BBC, he made a film called Black Safari, which was the journey of 4 Africans to the center of Britain, renaming the flora and fauna, and really looking at Britain from a black perspective in the early 70s. This was all done with a very Trini sense of humor.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, it was tongue-in-cheek, very much. And just in the way that Calypsonians had been tongue-in-cheek in their criticisms of Trinidad and the powers to be, the Queen, etc., Britain. So just in the same way, people like Darkus and Horace challenged British society with the same tour de force. They were very brave in what they were able to achieve and the questioning that they set forward with, you know.
And of course, that's really apparent because all of what you have contextualized about his life becomes very apparent, becoming the first Black director of a feature film in Britain with Pressure. Yeah.
I would say to give credit to those before him, men like C.L.R. James, George Padmore, etc., you know, that had really achieved amazing things in that period in time in terms of the questioning and also the investigation of invisible histories that we now take for granted.
So he was building on all of those histories, right?
Very much.
The pioneers that come before him. So Pressure. There is, of course, a section in Life Between Islands dedicated to pressure or the notion of pressure in the 70s and 80s. Talk to us a little bit about this film.
Pressure was the first Black British feature film that really focused and looked at what it was to be Black and British at that point in time. This is way before what is now being hallmarked in terms of new exhibitions, etc., where people like David and Sonia appear on the horizon in the mid-80s.
David Bailey, Sonia Boyce.
Thank you very much, I'm just saying this in relationship to your show upstairs, Life Between Islands. But in that moment, what was interesting was that there hadn't been anything that really marked out what the difficulties were for young Black kids born in the UK. To give you some idea of that, you know, the parent generation talked often about Trinidad and palm trees and the beautiful Tropicana of the Caribbean, none of which was in the presence of that generation that had been born in the UK without any knowledge of the Caribbean at that point. It was too expensive to go home, and most British people saw you still as an immigrant, even though you were born in Britain. So often you were faced with the remarks, go back to where you came from, and there was this identity crisis. Horace and Samuel Selvin and others like him felt the need to make work that really spoke on behalf of those children, to give them a sense of self and place, and also to parent them in such a way that they might question the agendas put forward to them in the future. So I think this was a really important landmark film. And it was also banned for the first 3 years after it was made for fear of inciting race riots that then took place in its absence. You know? So it was quite comedic in that sense. The film was made for, I think, less than £15,000 in 1975. And it's a 90-minute film. Everybody involved worked for free. It was a real passion of love and belief in that sense and commitment. And I mean, I was very lucky to have been born into a parent generation that were very committed, not just to their own children, but to the community at large. And I think that was really, really important. That's what set me on my path. It's very much the baton I feel I've inherited, not just from Horace, but from the village that he was amidst at that point in time in Ladbroke Grove.
Well, and that's what you see. We're going to show a clip now of taken from Pressure, and I think this is the part at the Black Panther meeting.
Okay, right, yeah.
So if we can roll it, thank you. Wow. Wow,
what a reminder.
Such a powerful, I mean, the whole film is gripping and compelling in that way, told through the eyes of young Tony, who is experiencing this transition from nice little boy to radical, to someone who's interested in this kind of social justice movement. Can you tell us a little bit more about the storyline, because not everyone would have seen?
The storyline really focuses on young Tony, who is born in the UK. He has an older brother that's from Trinidad. His parents were accountants that have to become greengrocers in Britain. And it very much deals with the paradox of not knowing one's own past in the Caribbean and how one finds a sense of identity in Britain at that point in time. I mean, to give you some examples, everything he's saying is right. We had 1 hour of reggae music a week on national radio that was given to us by a white DJ. Possibly 1 hour of R&B a week that you could find somewhere on national radio again, but nothing to identify with at that point in time in terms of any self-representation of us as British citizens or young British kids. And I think it's fascinating. From there we pick up, and really my generation are the generation that learned to do things for themselves. You've had Jazzy here and other people like him. I mean, we're all from that school that decided, you know what, in many respects, we're probably unemployable. So we'd best find our own way in life. And that's what we learned in that moment, I think. You know, it was really interesting in terms of survival.
I mean, we can spend 2 hours on Horace and his accomplishments. I bring this up because he was also an accomplished photographer.
Very much,
some of the photographs are in Life Between Islands, and just the luminaries that he got to photograph, activists. James Baldwin, you refer to him as Jimmy Baldwin?
Jimmy, Uncle Jimmy, but also Jimmy. Samuel Selvin, the great John LaRose, who founded the Caribbean Arts Movement, Andrew Sulkey, and Barbara Bees here carrying a pig's head. This was Darcus Howe's wife. She was a very militant activist and had more charges as part of the Mangrove 9 situation than any of the men involved. Her son, Darcus Jr., also went on to sign Amy Winehouse.
Oh, wow.
So interesting, all of the things that were happening kind of simultaneously in the Grove. James Baldwin came to London with Dick Gregory in 1969 to talk to an African and Caribbean group. And it was an insightful document that Horace made on him and the conversations he had there. But very powerful and moving in the way that those situations happened. Jimmy came onto a stage talking about himself as an American Negro, only to be heckled by a West Indian crowd that were saying, "Why you call yourself a Negro? You're a black man. Stand firm." And then he had to defend himself to an African and Caribbean audience that he wasn't used to, with that kind of aggressive manner,
Yeah.
The result was the best defensive explanation that I think James Baldwin had given to date. It's a film well worth reviewing, and it's available on YouTube if you can't find it anywhere else. But Horace was very, he almost had a second sense in how to be in the right place at the right time. And that was really his gift as a photographer and a filmmaker, was understanding what to look at and when, and why this might be important, and why in the future also. I mean, he had a real sixth sense in that sense.
I want to go on to talking about you and your work, because you, let's say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
No, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in quite a militant household in West Hampstead. My mother had been a speaker for the Communist Party and then the Socialist Workers' Party, where she met Horace. She insisted that he goes to film school. And on first application, he was declined. And she looked at him and said, "Are you going to take no for an answer? They've never had a black student. Go back and tell him, you have to have a place in the school." He did that, and it worked. And he sat next to Michael Mann in class for 3 years. And then his first film was on Eye of the Needle, which was a film on acupuncture. For me, I lived in an infectious household where our backyard became a place of activism. Michael X, who ran the Black Power movement, lived on the top floor, and most of the meetings happened either in our house or in the garden behind. This put me into contact with all sorts of interesting characters, and you know, when you grow up in that kind of environment, you're spurred on, in a way, to be the best of yourself and taught not to be scared, that you have to stand up and be brave and be accountable. And I think one of the most important things Horace taught me was how to see, not only in terms of visually as an artist, but how to recognize what to look at, how to recognize injustice, how to speak out for others, most importantly also. And then with photography, how to document and look at history in such a way that we might reveal what had been invisible prior. And this is something that has been very important to me in my practice ever since. And I feel that the baton I was given in that moment was very much about the revelation of invisible histories and how we pronounce who we were and who we are and who we are yet to become. If that's the best way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, because you're also, with your father, documenting Carnival in Trinidad.
Yes.
Working with him as
And that was an epiphany for me also.
Right, yeah, because then you made the transition from documenting to making.
Yeah, and interesting also when you're a kid growing up in Britain to go back to Trinidad or to Jamaica and to try and find your place and your sense of belonging and also your sense of necessity. And it was an epiphany for me. I found all three. The thing I became fascinated by was Old Mass in the Trinidad Carnival tradition and what an exceptionally revolutionary tool it had been for Trinidadians.
Can you explain?
Yeah, of course, I can. Carnival was given to slaves as a moment to celebrate. And we soon learned to use how that might be used as a tool to mock our masters. Through costume and exaltation, one realizes that I can be anything, not just who you have duped me to be in life, to see myself as small, when actually I can be bigger. I can be a king, a god, a queen, or whatever. And in that moment, I can also question this injustice in our relationship and make determined to you that I am free in my mind and can be anything. To me, that was quite an incredible revelation. And the thing I became interested in was how these old world mythologies that had been vitalized in the carnival that taught us about Africa, that taught us about this incredible kind of iCloud of an imagination where all of this stuff had been pulled. The revelation for me was partly in how to recontemporize these old world mythologies so that they might have a contemporary voice in the future and that our traditions wouldn't just die out. It's very important that we carry our ancestors with us into the future, that we don't just make that journey alone. And that was the revelation for me in that moment. And what I realized was that with the inception of New World materials, graphite, plastics, all kinds of things, that mass and African traditions in sculpture and printmaking, etc., could develop to become the Afrofuturism that we now recognize today. And in discussion about Afrofuturism, I mean, to me, it doesn't begin in 1989. It begins as soon as we were on the ship.
You're getting ahead.
All right. Sorry, Julie. I'll slow down.
Stop you right here.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. But remember the thought.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, of course, you've said Carnival is the foundation of your art practice, using modern materials, et cetera, to reimagine mythologies, et cetera. So in this series, the Invisible Man series, these, series of 40 or 87 totemic sculptures, I see Carnival. I see that amassing and grouping very intentionally.
I had got this commission because 154, which is an African art fair, had just taken its place at Somerset House.
Right.
And they'd never used the court. And I had an opportunity to make an installation artwork for the court at Somerset House. When I began to do research, I discovered that this was, in 1600, the palace of King James, who had rewritten the English Bible. And his wife, Queen Anne, had set about a masked ball called The Mask of Blackness, which was written by Ben Jonson 5 years after Macbeth. In that mass, her and 9 English princesses play African deities of the Niger. And within the script, in order to be victorious, they have to come to Britain and bathe in the sea of whiteness in order to realize their true beauty. It was the first use of blacking up. And as we know, King James pushed at high speed towards the indifference between black and white to endorse slavery. Also with the rewriting of the Christian Bible. So I was very interested in how I might make an artwork that spoke as a rebuke to that. And this came about because I was given a statue as a small figure by Horace on a trip to Kenya. And my father had taken me back to Africa on multiple expeditions with him to understand our history and our roots. And I started to think, what really is a diaspora? And how does it begin and what is its journey? I was interested in the use of graphite as a kind of old world, but yet future world material, and as something away from the experience of ebony wood, which, if you look in any African museum, is very prevalent, but also very distant to who we are right now. And one of the things I was interested in is the multiplication of my statue now becoming 40. Those that look African, that aren't born on the continent, whose trajectory is now to begin, right, moving forward into the kind of new globalization. So it was a statement about identity and displacement.
And emancipation.
And emancipation, most definitely, yeah. And regal protest in that sense, you know.
So when you're standing next to it, you are, this is adult height in a way. So they really would have taken over the court in Somerset House.
Absolutely, yeah.
What was the response?
I think the response was fascinating. It was really interesting to have 40 like that because it allowed people to almost have their own guy to mingle with. I think for a lot of people, it may have been the first time they've been amidst 40 African male nudes in that sense, quite literally.
Right.
You know, intimately as well, I might add. So, yeah, it was very important, I think.
Yeah.
And again, tongue-in-cheek in that sense.
Yeah, right. We're getting to the Afrofuturism moment, but I'm really interested in, I think it's Hands Up.
In Hands Up?
Hands Up, yeah, because the ROM acquired this work, right? Does this work?
They did, exactly.
I'm interested in the title and the kind of reference.
I mean, the title really came about because of the political siege that we were under in the year that was made. It was 2018, and there were a lot of situations where it was like we were becoming victimized. The piece I've made from an African traditional figurehead that I've cast in graphite, and then the floor plate and front of an old school Vespa. And it is literally that. It's that kind of a mashup.
And you do that a lot.
I do.
You do that a lot.
The other
with
piece,
materials.
the Upsetters, was something that was very important to me because I always felt that sound system was our religion as a kids in the UK. Very much. Just in terms of the messages that were given across the speaker systems, literally, you know, the whole Rastafarian movement, the fact that many of us were probably fatherless kids, and this was where the voice of fathers and mothers told us to respect our African brothers and sisters and eat ITIL food and believe in ourselves. And sound systems in the UK in that point were very important for West Indian kids to have some sense of identity that enabled a disconnect, right? In terms of how you then kind of purported to understand the culture that you had come from back in Trinidad or Jamaica or Barbados.
Well, I mean, you've already spoken about it, but you say about the sound system that it galvanized a community.
Yes.
It was able to speak to. Whatever came through this interface was a language that spoke about culture, spoke about the past, and it spoke about pride.
Yeah.
And I mean, you literally see this in this, you know, building of different speakers.
Absolutely, yeah.
Using different materials, and again, totemic. So you're always using that form. Can you speak about that a little bit? Because you really see it in the later work that you do.
Absolutely, but I also think, in a way, what's interesting is it's like the grandparent of hip-hop and all the music forms that we're now in today. And one of the things that's also interesting is where reggae music and calypso music leaves its acoustic moment to become electronic. And I find it's interesting how the power of that influence, once it's synthesized, and how it's literally the power of that sound indoctrinates the whole white Western world. Style and influence are very important aspects of how we make change. After the Notting Hill riots in the 50s, it was Claudia Jones that made the suggestion, we need a carnival in London so that our white neighbors understand aspects of our culture that they might like. As appeasement, literally. The blues had the same relationship post-slavery. Reggae music and calypso did the same thing for people of the Caribbean in entering New York and London and Toronto, right? It was very much cultural appeasement for us in new locations. And I think this continues today, that very much so.
Well, bringing parts of home with you.
Yes.
That you can recognize, that feel familiar. And sometimes there's a mashup and that becomes hip hop.
Yeah, it's how that also becomes the food of the new world order and new culture that we surmountably happens post our arrival, generations later. How this has influence on white culture and the white musical cultures and artistic cultures and even language today. I came from a generation that was where white people predominantly spoke with Cockney accents in London. They now speak Jafaican. And it's a hybrid.
Explain Jafaican.
Jafaican is a hybrid of Cockney and Caribbean language that every white English working class kid now spouts, right?
Example. Give me an example.
Anybody that you would see kind of within black sports, grime, music, they all use this kind of Jafaican accent now. Cockney is redundant, it's done. I mean, I was the last generation to encounter that.
Right.
Now the working class language and lingo of London and the other parts of Britain has all these delicate Caribbean intricacies that come from this. And what I tried to do with Get Up, Stand Up was really look at 50 years of influence of Caribbean arts and culture on Britain and how surmountably it's changed the culture throughout, literally throughout. So that was very important in trying to show the power of that influence and what change that really affected for all of us as kids, black or white,
So here I want to speak a little bit about your definition of Afrofuturism, because I think these works definitely reference, there's that inference. What is your definition? Because there's so many, there's a kind of range.
I mean, interestingly, when people talk technically about Afrofuturism, it's something that's coined in the 80s, etc. It's like, no way. It began as soon as we left this ship. When you look at, steel pan only came to be because drumming had been banned in groups of 7 or more. I think that still the law states that in Trinidad, right? We then moved to tambu bamboo, where 7 or 8 men or women would have to carry a different length of bamboo in order to make one note to play a song. And then with the leasing of Trinidad to the Americans during the Second World War, also came the use of oil drums because Trinidad was leased as an oil depot to the American army, right? So this is where suddenly oil drums came into play and steel pan has its birth moment as a replacement for drumming or African traditions in that sense, in terms of how one might still celebrate one's African cultural past and move forward again with our ancestors. So for me, that was really like, wow. So Afrofuturism really begins as we depart from the continent and have to reimagine who we are for our children and our children's children. And what I became fascinated by was how that imagination is pulled between a community and the necessity of that place kind of that sits like a cloud above all of us, that tells us to maintain self-belief and to recognize that at some point we will resist and get beyond this, and survive.
So this work in particular,
Nubian Return,
I think speaks to exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
What is the return? What is the vessel? Who is the subject? Who's
Absolutely.
The figure?
In this instance, it's a sister invested in that moment, aware, alive, thinking, pertinent, questioning. Even the Invisible Men, my first interpretation of them were figures with cameras. It's interesting when you start to think, we've always been recorded and documented. What happens when we record you? What do we see? One of the things that James Baldwin and Horace were very, very interested in was the idea that we don't only tell our own stories. We have to know the white world beyond us so well in order to survive, that we have an opinion and a place in looking at the Western world around us and how we start to tell your stories beyond just our own.
Well, this is intergalactic now.
Yeah. So this is me really taking those ideas and trying to place them in other mediums, if you like.
And the titles are very interesting. Skylarking.
Yeah.
In Caribbean lingo, explain what if one skylarks.
The great Horace Andy dub tune, Skylark, was what came to mind. And I always imagined that the guy who made this rocket ship was almost like a sound system boffin somewhere on the edge of Kingston or somewhere like that, who finds objects, and this is homemade in a very Caribbean style, kind of rough and ready, if you like. Not slick, you know, but powerful and forceful. And I like that measure with all these works, that there's a kind of rough edge to them.
Totally.
Yeah, it's very important.
But also about, this is something you and I spoke about, resilience and survival.
Yeah, absolutely.
And resistance.
Yeah, always resistance.
Are also kind of part and parcel of these works. And you're doing this in 2018 and 2011, way before a lot of people are thinking in terms of materiality and form and objects about Afrofuturism in this way. So that's why they really are so intriguing to me.
I mean, I began in photography, obviously as Horace's assistant, apprentice, whatever you want. And then on journeys back to Trinidad, documenting Carnival, I got jealous and I wanted to become a maker, right? Not just a documenter. That was very, very important to me in understanding the framework of what that was. And I was interested in, I mean, obviously resilience, resistance, Afrofuturism. These are the things that began with Kitchener and Sparrow, right? This is a long time history of resistance in Trinidadian culture, right? Stemming way back. So how now?
Just tell the audience who Lord Kitchener is and
Lord
Sparrow.
Kitchener is I'm sure the very important Calypsonians within the tradition of Trinidad music, and they were very important at the point of independence in Trinidad and its breakaway from Britain, and defining itself as its own thing in that sense, quite literally.
Social commentary.
Yeah, social commentary, etc. And obviously these men and women were the biggest influence on Horace's generation, which gave them this, I think it's very important that when you're handed things like that, when you see bigger people around you, you learn how to be big. Very much like David and Goliath or whatever the situation is, that big people or big moments allow you the space to identify and stand up.
Lift up.
It's very similar to what I was trying to do with something like the Moko Jumbi that you have upstairs.
Too early.
Okay.
Almost there.
But you get me, right? It's that thing that you interface with something that allows you to realize you can be bigger.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I had received that very much from my peers, and that's what led me into what I'm doing now. Is really where I'm going.
Well, I skipped one, but I really want to spend some time on this one because this is just, I don't even know, I don't have the words to describe. It's a totem, it's a robot, it's a rocket, it's the mothership connection.
And it's a she, yeah.
And it's a she.
Absolutely. What can I say? I've long since been, actually, this is thanks to Horace again, but in 1976, Parliament with George Clinton and the mothership connection came to the UK.
I wish we could cue that now, but anyway.
It changed me forever. Forever. I mean, I just couldn't get past that and never have, ever. The psychedelic freedom that they were enabling, the use of language and abstract thoughts, everything about that whole thing really blew me away, and it has done ever since. Like so many of my peer group that pushed that whole ethos in hip-hop and other mediums. I realized also, and this is something I talk about a lot, is that really as an artist, the bravery I saw in other black artists initially were musicians who stood up and saw themselves as being different, who spoke vocally and outlandishly about our situations, who dressed in literally in masquerade on a daily basis in order to encapsulate a sense of freedom that we hadn't arrived at. And I always wanted to kind of emulate that and grow towards that in a sense. Yeah. You know, and I tried to do so in my work, to try and find that freedom and that bright, empowering sensibility where anything is possible.
Well, I think that's why this is so fascinating, because you're crossing so many boundaries. The fact that that helmet is a Mende helmet mask worn by Sande women in Liberia and Sierra Leone. That's part of a secret society only for women. Yeah. So the fact that you cross that threshold, and usually ebony colored wood, but you colorize, like these are bright pinks and blues.
Yeah, and it lights up.
And it lights up.
Absolutely.
And it lights up.
And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because for me, when I went back to the British Museum as a kid, and you see these things in ebony wood, dusty, in these little boxes, how do you find your way into a tradition that's so far removed from where you're at in your own space? And again, it was the Carnival that taught me, wow, if you can infuse New World materials with the reverence of the African designs that are the tradition of your culture here. I mean, it's limitless where you can go and what you can do looking at this aspirational sense of culture. And I've tried to run with that.
Well, now we get to Moko Jumbies.
And this picture is interesting because this is my first documentation of Moko Jumbies in Trinidad. And it's a very different representation to the one that you have in your space.
Right. Describe Moko Jumbi for the audience.
Moko Jumbi is, I mean, we've nationalized Moko Jumbis in the Caribbean as our kind of folkloric heroes, I guess because of their stature, because of their kind of superpower, emblematic style and charisma. But this is an art form that begins in Mali and Senegal in West Africa. And as I understood it, Moko Jumbis also came with us during slavery, wading across the Atlantic as our protectors. And to me, it was just such a beautiful story and history with characters that stand, 15 to 20 foot tall above us, that it smashes any definition of how limitations have been placed upon us. So to me, it was a character that symbolizes rebellion, freedom, emancipation, and the ontology, or the ongoing cultural symbolism of who we are, held up with pride. One of the things that's important in my practice is never to bleed on a canvas. I always want my work in some way to be positive and radiant in terms of what it portrays and how we find ways creatively to overcome the obstacles that are placed in front of us. It's very important. I mean, it's really an artist's duty to find solutions.
Absolutely.
And this is something that I think about a lot within my practice. And I know inherently this is something I was given to champion as well, in that sense.
I was going to try and play a little clip of the Moko Jumbi in action. I don't know that I'm going to be able to do that, so I might have to move on.
So I guess it's like, for me, really thinking about tools of emancipation and how a child might encounter a Moko Jumbi, per se, in your corridor. Right. And engage in that moment in a one-to-one. And know that recognizably is your deity for you. You know, and I think that's very important.
Well, I mean, your first sculpture, Moko Jumbi, was for a commission from the
British Museum. Yeah.
What was that? How did they commission the work?
Oh, gosh, that was really, really interesting. A little bit scary at the same time because the British Museum had never recognized art from the Caribbean and had no prior works there at all. And we were leading up to 50 years of Notting Hill Carnival. And I think they were beginning to feel quite squeamish and guilty about the fact that here were millions of Caribbean immigrants that called themselves Britons at this point, and we've never, ever recognized why you were here, why you were brought here, how endemically you became a part of this culture, and the history literally set about by slavery, right? That is the wealth of this nation that brings you right to this museum in this moment. And so I was asked to make 2 works that spoke about the relationship between Africa and the Caribbean. And it was as loose as that. And in thinking about that, it really was the Moko Jumbi for me had to be the champion in that moment. Somebody that walks tall and proud, literally. And that was the definition of what I wanted to imbue for those works. They now sit in the Africa Sainsbury's Gallery right opposite all of the important masks from each of the tribes. And for me, it's very much a 360 moment that our own Caribbean Africanist ancestors can live side by side with the cultural deities of the continent. It's a very important situation.
But originally they were in the Great Hall of the British Museum.
Yeah.
And so here you see the scale
Absolutely,
of the work,
yeah.
which is fascinating.
Yeah.
And you change the heads so there are 2 different sculptures.
Absolutely.
But the heads are very different. Can you just talk quickly about what are they referencing? Is this an African mask that you also were thinking about? Or,
yeah, very much. This is actually the first time I used the mask from The Invisible Man
okay.
in this piece. And it was the first time I'd used doilies.
Right.
As the head dressing. I wanted something that felt very Caribbean in that sense.
Right.
And we always had that special room that you could never sit in or enter.
Yes.
Right? It was just for like doctors
Upstairs.
or some right? Covered in these beautiful doilies that grandmothers had made and aunties had made in order for working class families to kind of step up, right? Mm-hmm. But there's something very special about that also, because it's homemade and you've done it yourself. I was endeared to that. And the use of doilies is something I ran with post that moment, and I've made a lot of works in crochet since to speak about kind of carnival abstracts or the whole thing of the Caribbean at that moment in time.
Right. And the plumes, the wings that are the banana leaves
Absolutely.
that continue
to
AGO Moko Jumbi.
Yeah. It's very much bushmen and women in that sense.
Yeah.
And I like the kind of futuristic notion of that almost feeling like tropical insects, the kind of metallic colorings of things that flitter around the Caribbean jungles and whatnot.
So
the bamboo stilts.
How did we get to this point in 2019?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I'm so proud of the work upstairs. I mean, I love the Black Power salute.
It's glorious.
The use of the chest piece was something I was very excited about.
Wait.
All right, Julie, come on, man. We're good.
I'm looking at time. I'm trying to...
No. Go back.
Okay,
it's all right. Go back.
Okay.
Right, let me carry on with this.
Okay, carry on with this. Okay.
The big hands and feet, right? Am I allowed to talk about that now?
Yes, you can. Yeah, yes, you can.
Good.
Go ahead.
I mean, ironically, as a child in Trinidad, one of the things that really used to make me laugh is, people don't know this, but before sneakers, we had barter plimsolls, right? And when you were playing masks for 24 hours and you had quite wide, big feet, you'd cut the toes out of the plimsolls you had so that your toes could breathe. And you'd see some of these bigger guys, big corns on all the toes, broken through their shoes. It was so funny to me. It was something I wanted to carry on traditionally within this. And I thought, well, what if I do that with a pair of Jordans, since they have such reverence now amidst the youth, and have the toes spilling out of the front? So I'm trying to make kind of old world, new world references with this. I also, in Trinidad, always like the fact that great masked men were often scrawny little things with big hands and big feet. And this emphasis on oversized hands and feet is something I've continued with in all of these masks. I think it's very important. It's real strength. In my mind.
But I mean, we didn't even talk about your concept.
Yeah.
It was, I'd like a I'd like to commission you to create a Moko Jumbi. But of course, I'd seen the work at British Museum, but you already had an idea of what you wanted.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
So, I mean, and this was the first rendering that I saw and shared with my colleagues.
Yeah.
And talk about this. This is the figure.
Well, what was exciting about this was suddenly we were in this COVID moment.
Yes, it was.
And suddenly it was like, all right, I had to use new technology that I hadn't used before. It was 3D scanning. I had a young masquerader from St. Vincent or somewhere, so come to the fabricators and pose for me so that he could be 3D scanned. And that's actually his face blown up as his chest piece.
Oh, okay.
And I was interested in the duality of identities. That here was this Sande helmet mask that represents something ancestral, but yet this young man's face is now the chest piece, and the arms of this character are his horns, the legs almost become his neckline, and we're dealing with kind of inner world, outer world, spirit and reality at the same time. I wanted this face to also be identifiable as somebody, a young person in this contemporary moment to recognize themselves, right, within this tradition almost, right? So it's like you're enveloped back into the past and the future. I was quite interested in that mashup and the surrealistic aspect of that, in a sense,
Well, because when you mentioned breastplate, originally I was like,
Yeah, well, no, we had a lot of debates, yeah. You weren't the only one. A lot of people questioned me on this as well.
So this is, again, some of your
this is the working drawings and the concept.
Yes, yeah.
And you can see here, this is the kind of structure that's necessary once this is cast in fiberglass, that there still has to be a metal frame that sits within that in order for the weight of what's up on the top to balance on these two little legs.
So you were working in your studio in Gran Canaria or in London?
Both.
Both.
Kind of designing at home and then taking my ideas back to the fabricators for them to help me implement this in real terms with weight and scale. The idea that you might run into this and it won't fall on top of you and that kind of drama. Yeah.
Right. Because we had some drama when we were installing it.
Yes.
You remember?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, absolutely. The hand fell off.
So great. So the breastplate and then gilded.
Right. Yeah. And this is obviously this is before it's been cast. So initially, this is you cut something like this out of a very fine foam plastic, and then it has to be cast. The cast is in fiberglass. And then this is gilded with gold leaf.
And how long did it take you?
Months.
It was months, because it was 2019.
Yeah, and it was a big team working around the clock. It was very intricate. I mean, they got very pissed off with me. They were like, this is way more than you had money for. I'm like, please, come on, let me just get this done. That whole thing. Oh, you can't put any more on this. You already spent your budget. I'm like, shut up, come on, please. It's always the way. But I think that always happens with any project. You can't help it. Get excited and try and, impair it with as much as possible. I mean, you can see here, these are all the leaves. All of this had to be hand marked, scored. It's a lot of work. It's a ton of work.
And I just used, again, the helmet mask, we talked about it, and this was your source.
I mean, this one we made in fiberglass, the head alone is 8 foot high. So it was a huge task to carve by hand in polyfoam and then cast. It had to be cast in 4 or 5 separate pieces. It's kind of boating fiberglass. And then to put the colors on, it's almost like a car window tint. It's like a film that has to go on top. And then, of course, there's the lighting and everything else and whatnot. Yeah. So it was a lot of work.
The same motif.
Yeah. But what was very important to me was that, unlike the ebony wood version, that with the light and a pulse, suddenly this work has breath. and is able to look back at you.
Right.
Right?
And the same for this one.
Yeah,
actually.
very much.
It's very much the same.
Yeah, very much. And I like the idea that you don't just encounter the work encounters you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very important.
Yeah. So again, in the studio before, and then not quite on all the stilts.
I mean, I love this still because that's what it is, you know, and everything else has to be dressed on top. But without that structure, this could never work. So, you know, it's how you then bury that inside your cast, all of it. Yeah, it's a big feat. Oh, bless. You look at that. It gives you an idea of scale.
And then it had to be installed.
Yes, it did, yeah.
I really have to shout out the installers because it was like watching a ballet, and we had you on, I think,
video. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And then the arm did get nicked. It didn't fall off. It got nicked, and then I had to be the bearer of bad news.
Yeah, that's right.
But we got it all sorted. But it was really quite an incredible thing to watch, as you witnessed.
Incredible. Yeah. I mean, I cannot thank you and your team enough for creating the opportunity for this. You know, it's very difficult as an artist. If people don't give you commissions, how do you step up in life? This is the opportunity to make something like this with the kind of time and consideration was never afforded to me in the UK. I've had to come all the way to Canada to find these, you know, a situation like this where I really got to do the best work I've done to date. This is by far the most important piece of work I've made.
Well, I want to take...
and I say that because unlike the mothership and other things, this carries the tradition of my family, and when it spiritually connects to me to my past historically, and gives me a sense of accomplishment that I had done this for my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my parents, and all the generations past. It was lovely to be able to give back like this. It was very important.
It meant so much to us, Zak, and I really do want to shout out an important person in the audience who, I mean, we can't do this. We need the funds. We had to, you know, convince some supporters. And someone stepped up and really helped finish it and helped us to acquire it. So I'd like to shout out David Bennett. He's very shy, but thank you.
David Bennett, thank you ever so much for allowing me this opportunity. Really, really, it's so important, I think, to all of us. And I'm really pleased to be here today to share this with you all and with you too, David. Thank you.
And we're going to end on this because this is the next iteration.
So I was recently given a public art commission in London to do 8 mural pieces in glass mosaic to speak about Notting Hill Carnival, which is now in its 52nd year. This is the first public art project that has been commissioned in Great Britain as an enabler to speak about Notting Hill Carnival. And I was very interested in using your particular Moko Jumbi from here as the character in the story that speaks about that tradition in Britain.
So I love that referencing.
Yeah,
so
me too.
It's just not the sculpture, now it lives as a mosaic and maybe something else. And
I think I'm very excited because it's not just a one-off sculpture. Your character has a whole lifespan and history of situations he could be in, or she, you know. So to be able to take that and run with it as a family member, as a friend, as a character, and put that in other mediums and other situations allows this amazing conversation and dialogue that connects these situations. And reciprocal. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Oh, no, thank you.
No, thank you. I just want to say thank you. Peter, you can speak to him after. Okay. I want to say thank you to all of you, and especially to Zak. Thank you so much, Zak.
Listen, can I thank you all also? Thank you very much for coming. But also, Julie, thank you so much for being my enabler with this commission and for bringing me to Toronto for the first time and to Canada. I'm enthralled. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for making this happen.